Hi, welcome to the ASP.NET MVC and Entity Framework step-by-step video tutorial. In this tutorial, we will learn how to create web applications by creating two small projects. One is a project like this university project where you can create new records, delete records, and so on. You can also implement search functionality and login and registration functionality either using our own system or by using third-party services like Google. You will also learn how to upload pictures in case you are interested in creating a social network site and many other features. You will also do a small sample project just to try out the various features that you created in the main project. Day 1, you will learn how to install the Visual Studio Express Edition and a small introduction to the MVC diagram. You will also learn the basic working of controllers, models, and views, and a small introduction to how a page is laid out and how a style sheet is used. Day 1, you will only learn the basics of the style sheet and layout, but you will learn them in detail in a later chapter. You will also learn how to create a database using class-first design. There are two ways to create web applications. One is a class-first design and another is a database-first design. In this course, you will learn to develop applications both ways. And we will finish off day 1 with a small review. Day 2, we will learn how to create, read, update, and delete records. And we will also learn how to implement search functionality and the use of helper methods. We will start off day 3 with a sample project, and then we will continue with our main project by learning validations and more complex models. Day 4, we will learn about concurrency issues, that is, if two people want to access the same page, how do you handle it? And we will also learn how to create tables out of inherited classes or how to create compound primary keys. We will also learn how to create other models, that is, if you have two classes, how do you create one table, or if you have one class, how do you create two tables. We will also learn how to handle exceptions and error pages. Day 5, we will learn how to implement login functionality, either using the inbuilt login feature or using a third-party service like Google. And then we will learn also how to change the theme and layouts of our page. We will also learn how to load pictures and files and how to implement logging in our application and the concept of partial views, that is, how to show multiple views in one page. Day 6, we will complete the small sample project, and then we will also learn how to create a database first design. That is, if you have an existing database, how to create a web application using the existing database. To install a free version of Visual Studio, search in Google for Visual Studio Express for Web and click on this link. And over here, you will see something like download. Now, by the time we are watching this video, you could have moved to another version of Visual Studio. That's fine. You can always install the latest version. There is usually only a small difference between one version and another version. So click on download. And over here, let us click on install now. It will ask you to log in. You need either an Hotmail account or live.com account. If you don't have a Microsoft account, you can sign up here, or if you have an Hotmail account or live.com account or outlook.com account, you can sign in here. Once you have signed in, you are given two choices. You can either try the ultimate version or you can install the free Express version. Now, you are not supposed to create production level application using the Express version. Express version is only meant for learning purposes. Let us click on Express version. It will download this vns_full and let us run this particular file. Here in the screen, it will ask you to accept some user agreements and so on. You can accept them and you can do an install. It is usually a straightforward installation. Now I'm going to draw and explain to you the MVC flow diagram or the model view controller flow diagram. Now you will not understand head or tail of what I'm talking about, but it's like a baby learning a new language. You still have to speak to them so that they can get used to the words and later on it will make sense. Same way, just listen to this topic. We'll keep coming back to this diagram again and again throughout our course, and then it will make more sense. In a web browser, when someone types in a URL like yahoo.com, it is considered a request. This request calls a program called a controller. Don't worry about what a controller is for now. It's just a program. It will call a program called a controller. This controller in turn may or may not call a program called a model. This model represents data. This model in turn may or may not call the database and fetch the data. And then if it fetches the data, it will send it back to the controller. The controller will then call a program called a view. View is nothing but web pages like .cshtml, because we are going to do C# web application. And then it sends back the response and the user is able to see that website. So basically, when you type in some URL, it calls a program called a controller. The controller may or may not go and fetch the data from the database using the model programs. It will go and fetch the data, come back to the controller. It will go and fetch an appropriate web page from the view, and it will display that particular data in that web page back to the user. Now that we have seen the MVC flow diagram, let us go create a project. Let us open the Visual Studio Express Edition. Now it doesn't matter whether you're using like Express Edition 2013 or a later version or an earlier version. There is usually a very small increment between versions. Sign in. You can sign in with your Hotmail account or live.com account. Once we are signed in, let us create a new project. Click on File, New Project. And on the left hand side, select Visual C# Web, and over here select ASP.NET Web Application. Now we will be learning the latest MVC 5 version, but there is actually very little difference between one version and another. Usually small increments, and for a new developer you don't really have to worry about which version. So I suggest that you follow this project using the same version as I do, so that there won't be any issues as such, and then you can experiment with any other version that may come in the future. Over here, let us browse to a folder where we can save our project. I'm going to save it in my C drive project, and let us give a name for this web application, my first project, and click OK. Over here you will be given many choices, like if you want to create a Facebook application or an empty application and so on. We are interested in learning an MVC application, so select MVC. Let us not worry about the other choices. Click OK. On the right hand side, you will see the Solution Explorer with the project created with a bunch of files and folders. If you are unable to see this window, you can always click on View and you will see Solution Explorer here, or you can see it in other windows, Solution Explorer. Now that we have created a project, let us just run this project. You can choose which browser to see your web application. Over here, you can either select Google Chrome or Internet Explorer. And let's click on Debug, Start Debugging. You notice that when you debug that application, a web page was opened for you and it went to some local host and some kind of a number here, a port number, and you will see this particular page. So what just happened? So let us go and play with this application to have a better understanding of what happened right now. Let us go back to our project, and you will see in your particular Solution Explorer a bunch of files. Some of the names would be familiar. You will see a folder called Controllers, a folder called Models, and a folder called Views. Now let us open the controller folder and let us open the home controller. You will notice that you will not be able to edit the home controller. The reason is we are in debug mode because we clicked on Debug, Start Debugging. So we have to get out of the debug mode. For that, click on the stop sign right here called Stop Debugging. If you had watched my C# video, I usually prefer the Debug Start Without Debugging menu item, but you will notice that it is missing right here. If you want to get that particular menu item, that is debug start without debugging, click on Tools, Settings, Import and Export Settings. Over here select Reset All Settings. Next. You can just reset the settings. Next. And in this, instead of basic settings, you can select expert settings and click on Finish. You can then see that debug start without debugging is available for you in the menu item. To learn about MVC, let us go manipulate a few things here. In the home controller class, you will see a bunch of methods called index, about and contact. These are called action methods. Now don't worry about what these action methods do as of now. In the index method, instead of this method returning some action result, let us just make it return a string. So if a method returns a string, so this return statement also should return a string. So here I have an return hello world. Now let us run this particular application. Let us click on debug, start without debugging. You will notice that the application started the web browser and then it displayed the word hello world. So how did this entire thing work? When you clicked on debug start without debugging, what happened was this particular project compiled and it was deployed to an IIS Express server. You will notice that particular server started on the lower right hand corner. You will see that an IIS Express server has been started. It comes with the installation, so you don't have to worry about installing this IIS Express server. So this application was deployed to that IIS Express server and it started a web browser and it called the local host. That means it called the local server at this particular port. This port is randomly generated, so you don't have to worry about it. Depending on which port is available, your web server will host it on that particular port. Your web browser will call the correct port and it will display this particular message. Now, how did this message come here? This particular URL, like localhost 52429, is like someone typing in yahoo.com. So when this localhost 52429 is called, it is considered a request. We saw that a request calls a controller. Now, if you don't specify which controller to be called, by default, it will call the home controller. So any request, so any URL to an application, if you do not specify which controller to be called, by default, it will call the home controller. So the application goes in search of the controllers folder and it calls the home controller class. Now inside the home controller, there are various methods. Which method will it call? If you do not specify which method to call, by default it will call the index action method. It will search and call the index action method. So here you can see that just like yahoo.com, a request, a URL called localhost was called. Since it did not contain any controller name or action method name, by default it called a class called home controller, and then inside that class called home controller, it called this index action method. So this index action method, you can see that it returns a string called hello world, and that is returned and it is displayed to the web page. So going back, this particular request came to the controller. It called the home controller, the index action method, and sent the response back to the end user. It never went to the model or the database or the views. It just came with the request, called the default controller and action method, and went back to the user. So now that we have seen how the default controller and action methods are called, let us learn how to call the other methods. For example, how do we call the about method? Imagine this about method is also going to return a string, and the return statement returns a string called this is the home controller about method. Now let us run this application. You would notice that I have changed my browser to Internet Explorer, but it doesn't matter. Whichever you're comfortable with, you can use that. Click on debug start without debugging. And here you will notice that by default it has called the home controller index action method. But now we want to call the home controller about action method. The way we do that is we have to say slash the controller name slash the method name. Now the controller name and method name in the URL are not case sensitive. URL is never case sensitive. This web address is never case sensitive. You can type in amazon.com in capital letters or in small letters, it doesn't matter. So when you say /home/about and you press enter, you can see that it has called the home controller's about action method and it returned the string. This is the home controller about method. So you can see that in the URL, you can specify which controller and which action method to call. Let us create another controller and we will play around with it. To create another controller, right click on controllers, click on add controller. Over here select MVC5 controller empty, click add, and we can give some controller name like say XYZ. Remember, the controller name should start with a capital letter and it should have the word called controller in the name, like home controller, account controller, finance controller. You need to have that name controller. Click on add. This XYZ controller came with a default method called index. We can rename this method as ABC and let it return a string, and the string says from XYZ controller ABC action method. Let's run this. So by default it called the home controller index action method. So if you want to call the XYZ controller, you have to type in the /XYZ, and you will notice that if I press enter after XYZ, it produces an error. The reason is the default action method that will be called will be the index action method under XYZ, because we did not specify the action method name. So if you say /ABC here, that is /XYZ controller name /method name ABC, and you press enter, you can see that it has called the XYZ controller ABC action method. The XYZ controller ABC action method. If you don't specify the controller name, it will call the home controller. But if you specify the controller name and you don't specify the action method name, it will call the action method. But since the index action method did not exist in the XYZ controller, it returned an error. So let us create another action method called index in the XYZ controller, and we will call this from XYZ controller index action method. Now when you run this and you say /XYZ, you can see that from XYZ controller index action method. If you don't give a controller name, it is the home controller index action method. And if you give the controller an action method name, it will call that appropriate controller's action method. So going back to our MVC diagram, you learned how to call a controller and an action method. So it's usually the website name /controller/ the action method name. You don't have to put that word called XYZ controller. You don't have to use like home controller. You cannot put that word controller right here in the URL, or you cannot say XYZ controller. You just have to use the home or XYZ. So if Yahoo had been built on ASP.NET MVC, which it isn't, a URL like this, like yahoo.com/finance/stock, means it called the finance controller under which there is a stock action method which it called. And all these requests just call the controller and returned a string. Now that we have seen how to call different controllers and different action methods, let us involve the model. So in your project, you will see a folder called models. It has a bunch of class files. Let's not worry about what they are for now. Let us create a model class. As we can see in this diagram, model represents data. So I'm going to create a model class called student. So to create a model class, right click on models, click on add, and then click on class. Over here, you can give a class name like say student. So we now have a class called student. So we now have a student class, and inside the student class we have the student ID, last name and first name. All of them are public. The student ID is integer, last name and first name, all of them have a getter and setter. Of course, you don't have to put this getter and setter right here, but this is conventional programming, and we saw that in C#, the use of these getters and setters. Now that we have a model class, let us make use of this model class in the controller. In the XYZ controller, let us create an object of student. So we have created an object of student, say student Alex equal to new student. Of course, it is not able to recognize the models folder because the student class is in the models folder. You can resolve it by right clicking, click on resolve, and then you can say using my first project.model. So it will import this particular projects folder in here. So here you can see that my first project.models has been imported, and that particular red line will go away. Let us give values for this particular object. So here we have given values for the particular object, alex.firstname equal to Alex and alex.lastname equal to Rod. So this is an example of making use of a model object or calling that particular model from the controller. So inside the controller you are creating objects of the model. Inside the controller you are making use of the model or the class files. In the home controller, before we made the changes, if you remember, the methods looked like this. Like it had something called as public action result, and then the method name, and then it had this return view. It was calling a method called view. Now what is this? So to explain this, let us see how this works first. Let us copy this action result, and in this ABC action method, instead of returning a string, let us return the action result. And here, instead of returning a text, we will return the view method. This is very similar to how the default action methods were created. Like the abort method had an action result as the return type, and it had a return view statement. We had removed it and we had returned a string, but now we are going to see the use of this particular action result and the return view method. Now, the first thing is this. When you say like return action result, when you call this return view method and which in turn returns this action result, what it means is the controller is going to call the view. The controller, when it hits that return view, is going to call the view. What view will it call? So to call a particular view, we first need to create a view. So what we will do is to create a view, right click on this ABC action method, right click on this ABC action method, and click on add view. You can leave the view name as it is. You don't have to worry about what it means. You can leave the view name as it is, ABC, and then we will click on add. Leave everything as it is and we'll click on add. Once it's created, you will see a web page called abc.cshtml. Basically, the name of the action method is given to the name of the page, and CSHTML means C# HTML page. It has some kind of a tag, H2 tag, which mentions ABC. You will see that this web page has been created under the views folder, under the folder called XYZ. If you remember, this XYZ matches the controller name wherever this action method was. This may sound a bit confusing in the beginning. Don't worry, as and when we create more views and more models, this will become very simple and easy to understand. In this abc.cshtml page, instead of this ABC, let us say something like, so in this abc.cshtml, we have typed in this particular sentence, hey, this is the abc.cshtml page under views XYZ folder. Now let's run this. Debug start without debugging. It has called the home controller index action method, but we need the XYZ controller and ABC action method. So here you can see that when we call the XYZ controller and ABC action method, it has returned this particular statement. Hey, this is the abc.cshtml page under views XYZ folder. So it has actually returned the web page. So how did this work? When we typed in the URL localhost some port number /xyz/abc, It came as a request. It called that particular controller and that particular action method, namely the XYZ controller ABC action method. It came here. It made use of the model to create a student object, but of course this was useless. We never made use of the student object. And then it hit this return view method. This return view method goes in search of that particular web page. Basically, when it sees this return view, it goes in search of the web page. Which web page did it go in search of? It will immediately see which controller is this view method being called. Since the view method is being called in the XYZ controller, it will go in search of a folder called XYZ under views. So it will go in search of the folder called XYZ under views. Now, under this XYZ folder, there will be many web pages. Which page will it call? It will analyze what is the name of this action method. Since the action method is called ABC, it will look for a page called abc.cshtml and it will return this particular page. Now this viewback.title on top is nothing but the title of that particular page. You will see that right here, page. And whatever you type in the title, it will come up right here. So we have learned now how to call a particular web page using the controller and action method, how to call a particular web page. Same way for the index method, let us call a web page. To call a web page, we cannot return a string, we have to return the action result. And we cannot return a string here, we have to return the view method. Now if I call this index method as it is, it will throw an exception because there is no index page under XYZ. Let us try it out. Debug start without debugging. So here you can see that when I call /XYZ, the index action method will throw an error because the index or master was not found. So we can create an index page. We learned how to create views or pages by right clicking on add view. You can either do that or you can also right click here on the folder, click on add and click on view. Either way is fine. In this case, you have to like hard code that particular view name. It will not give you the view name like say index, but you will have to type it in. So that is why it's always better to add the view right here so that it will come up with the correct name. Click on add. Let the title be the same, the index page. You can click on build rebuild solution, debug start without debugging. So now when we call /XYZ/index, it comes like this is the XYZ index page. Now you may have a question. Okay, this page is being returned. What about all these other stuff? Register, login, contact, home, where did these come from? What about this statement? Where did this come from? How do I change this? We will see the answers for them very soon. Now that we have seen how to call a particular controller and an action method and thereby call a particular view, let us learn how to call a model, how to make use of the model and then present it in a view. If you go to any website, the idea behind the website is go fetch the data and fetch the appropriate view and display the data. That is what web applications are all about. If I click on a particular DVD, fetch the details of that particular DVD and then fetch an appropriate web page and display the details of that particular DVD. Same thing goes for search. If I search for something, go fetch the data and then find an appropriate web page and display it. So looking at this particular MVC, the controller, what it does is based on what kind of a request it is, either a link or a search item, it will go and fetch the appropriate data from the database using the model classes. It will fetch the appropriate view and then it will combine the model with the view and display it as a response to the user. We have learned how to call a particular view, but now we have to involve the model. We will worry about involving the database later. As we have seen before, in the XYZ controller, we already created an object of student. The student is the model. The student model had the student ID, last name and first name. and we created an object of the student and we assigned the last name and first name. Now I want to display the student object in that particular view. So to display a student object in that view, we have to pass that student object to the view. The way we do that is put that object within these parentheses. Now this ABC page under the XYZ view will receive this particular object. So let us go to the abc.cshtml page under XYZ, views XYZ abc.cshtml. This page will now receive that student object called Alex. It will receive the student object called Alex. To indicate that the abc.cshtml receives one student object, we have to put this code right here on the very first line. At model, project name, the folder name and the class name. So this particular line, it says this page called abc.cshtml receives one object of this student, class, because in the XYZ controller we are sending one object of the student class called Alex. In here, if we want to display that particular student object, we want to display the details of the student in the web page, we can get the values of the student class using this code. I will say at model.firstname. The one thing I want you to notice is it uses capital M instead of small m. You use small m model right here on the very first line and you use capital M model right here. This model represents the student object which is being passed to this particular web page. So whatever the student object, Alex's first name will be printed right here. Let's run this and see. Save it and run it and call the xyz/abc, and you will notice right here it has printed out Alex, that is Alex's first name. And now I am going to print out the last name too. Make sure you go to xyz/abc so that you are calling that particular control, and here you will notice that it has also printed out the last name. It came in one line because there was no break statement in the HTML. If you want it in next line, you can put a break statement and so on. These are HTML tags like h2, break and all those things. If you don't know HTML, you can quickly brush up on the basics of HTML on any internet site, and you will see them right here one after another. You can also make it beautiful like this. I have included like h2 student name colon and then this ampersand sign, which denotes that okay, I'm going to write C# code. Remember, this ampersand sign denotes that this is going to be my C# code from now on. I'm going to access the model, which is the student object, and I'm going to print out the student's first name and the last name. With that example, we learned how to make use of the data to be displayed on a particular web page. So you have seen most of the flow. You have seen how a request calls a particular controller, which in turn calls or creates an object using the model classes, calls a particular view, displays that particular model object in that particular view, and sends the response back. In the same example, let us create multiple student objects. So here we have 3 student objects, student Alex, Linda and John. Make sure when you copy paste that the Linda names are given here and John names are given here too. All of them have a first name and last name. Now we want to send all these 3 objects to that web page called abc.cshtml. Now to send all these objects to that particular web page, what we need to do is we need to create a list and put these objects in that particular list. So here we have created a list of students. Remember, we learnt about lists in C#, it's the collection framework. So we are going to create a list of students, and this is a generic list where you can only add student object. And we have added 3 objects, that is Alex, Linda and John, to this particular students list. If you get red lines, you just have to right click and resolve. Right click, resolve using system.collections.generic just in case, and you will notice that using statement right here, just like we saw previously. Now this list of students we want to pass to the view. So here, instead of return view Alex passing one object of student, we are going to pass the list of students. And here in this abc.cshtml page, we have to say that this web page is now going to receive a list of students. We had previously mentioned that this web page receives one student object, but we have to mention that this receives multiple student objects or a list of student objects. The way we do that is, we have to put this word called IEnumerable and greater than and less than symbol right here. This statement denotes that this abc.cshtml receives a list of student object. IEnumerable is nothing but an interface which basically denotes a collection. So it says this abc.cshtml receives a collection of student object. Once we have mentioned that this page receives a collection of student object, whenever we receive any collection, what do? We need to loop through that collection. We can loop through that collection using a for each statement. We can use a var or student object. So here I have for each var item in model. This is like some temporary variable in model. Now model holds a collection, open curly braces and close curly braces, open curly braces, close curly braces. And here instead of at model, we will use at item because item contains each and every student object. So here you can see that we are using a for each statement to loop through those list of students. Model with a capital M represents a list of students. You don't need the at symbol right here because since we already have the at symbol right here, it's all C# code and there is HTML and then there is C# code. The space is HTML and then once again there is a C# code. So here you can see that we loop through the list of students and we printed all the student names. Now you may have a question. Wait, you just showed how to display one object and how to display a bunch of the same objects. But what happens if I want to display like one object of student, one object of like say department, one object of instructor in the same page? How do we do that? Can we have multiple statements like this? One saying student and one saying instructor? No, you cannot have that. So if we cannot have multiple statements, multiple model statements, how do we send different objects? How do we send different objects to this particular web page? Because a web page may involve different types of objects. I want to display the student. I also want to display the department information. So how do we do that? We'll see that in the next topic. So in the previous example, we created a bunch of student objects or one student object in the controller using the model class, and then we passed that student object or the bunch of or the list of student objects to the view, displayed it in the view, and we returned the view to the user. In the next example, we want to display data from multiple classes. So how do we do that? Let us create a class called course under models. Right click on models folder, add class, course, and in this class called course, we have a course ID, course name, and total credits. In our XYZ controller ABC action method, let us create an object of this course. So we created a math object with the course name math 101 and total credits is 4. So now we want to display both the course object and the student object in the abc.cshtml. But the restriction is every page can either display only one object of a class or multiple objects of the same class. So with that restriction in mind, how can we display objects of two different classes? What we can do is create a third class which will in turn contain objects of these two classes. For example, we can create another class, we can create another model class called like say course students. So I will name the third class as course underscore students. In this course underscore students class, we have one object of course and we have a list of students. We can now make use of this model. We can now create an object of this new model course underscore students. And we can say object.course is equal to the math course. Object.course is equal to the math course. So the math object will be assigned to object.course. If you remember, this course is nothing but an object of course. Same way, object.students receives a list of students. We already have a list of students with Alex, Linda and John. And so these students are assigned to the course underscore students object, object.students equal to students. And we are passing this one object of course underscore student to the view. Now that this ABC view is receiving one object of this course student, the very first line will no longer be IEnumerable. Instead, it will be an object of course underscore students. So now this one object of course underscore students has one object of a course and one object of a list of students. So how do we display that? Now this one object of course underscore students has a list of students. So what we can do is we can say in model dot students. So this will take care of looping through the list of students in this model. And here we are saying course title colon at model dot that model's course object and that particular course object's course name. Now let's run this. So here you can see the course title Math 101 and the list of students being displayed. So even though there are restrictions like only one model can be displayed or a list of a particular model can be displayed, there is no restriction as to the number of models we can create. If you want one page to display information from multiple classes, you can create these kind of models which in turn contain the objects of the other classes. You can either create one object of that other class or you can create multiple objects of that other class. There is a name for these kind of classes. These kind of classes are called view models, and they are usually kept in their own folder. So let us create another folder here. Right click on the project, add new folder, and let's call this folder view models. In this view models, we can just drag the course underscore students right here. You can drag them and paste them right here. Make sure that once you drag and paste it, that you change the namespace. Namespace indicates where exactly is the location of that particular class. Now it is in the view models class. You will have these red lines here saying that it is unable to find the class files course and student. Remember, course and student are in a different folder. So you can always resolve it. Right click, resolve. Once you resolve it, you will see that the using statement comes here and the red lines will go away. You also have to make sure that in the XYZ controller you will have errors. Always remember to read your errors. For example, if you run this application, you will see that there are build errors. You need to read your errors. There were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build? No. And then we can go here and read what kind of errors are there. In the error list, right here in the window, you can see the list of errors here. If you are unable to see this window, remember you can always bring back a window that you closed by clicking on view, and you will either see them right here like error list, or you will see them in other windows. So in this case, the error says the type or namespace course underscore students could not be found. Are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? Yes, of course, this class XYZ controller, since it's in the controller folder, it's unable to locate the course underscore students class. All we need to do is right click, resolve, and click on the using my first project.view models. If the error does not immediately go away, you can always save and rebuild solution. Most of the time, if you feel like after resolving, if the error does not go away, click on build rebuild solution. Debug start without debugging. And here let us go to the XYZ/ABC. So here once again, when I run this application, you can see an error XYZ/ABC. It says the type or namespace course underscore students does not exist in the namespace myfirstproject.models. It is unable to see that in the views actually. So here also make sure you will change it to dot view models. Now when you go to xyz/abc, everything works fine, but now the class is in view models. Whenever you move classes, make sure that you go and change in all the places by resolving. You may get some errors. Whenever you want to resolve errors, make sure you click on build rebuild solution, which will tell you exactly what the errors are. Now we learned that when a particular view is called using the controller and action method, that particular CSHTML page is returned to the user. For example, the index.cshtml under the XYZ controller returns this is the XYZ index page. But if you notice, the XYZ index page alone is not displayed. We also have this kind of a color scheme, and we have this header and footer information. So how do we control those information? How do we change the header and footer, and how do we change this color scheme? When a web page is returned, like for example index.cshtml, you just don't see the index.cshtml file alone. You also see a file called layout. The web page that is returned to the user is usually combined with the layout, and then it is presented to the user. The layout page usually contains the company logo, header and footer information, and the color scheme for that particular web application. For example, in Amazon.com, whichever page you go to will have this Amazon logo, it will have the search bar, also it will have this kind of footer information right here. Since these information are present in every page, it makes no sense to program them in all the pages that we are developing. So it's better to put them in a template or what you call a layout. So the layout of a web application will contain information like logo, menu items, or anything that should be common for all the web pages in your application. And that page that you are returning, for example the index.cshtml or the abc.cshtml, is usually presented inside that layout. So where exactly is the layout located, and how do you manipulate the layout? Under the views folder, you will see a folder called shared, under which there is a layout.cshtml. This layout.cshtml has all the information that is available in the header and footer of the application. For example, you have something called as an application name. Instead of application name, we can say something like patrickvideos.com. You can save it. You can build rebuild solution or debug start without debugging. Make sure you go to XYZ index, and here you can see that instead of application name, we have patrickvideos.com. Any web page that we go to in the application will now show patrickvideos.com. Don't worry about the action link. We will learn about action links very soon. The same thing you can do for the footer. You can keep the footer empty if you want, or you can put your contact information right here. So if the layout is controlled over here, where exactly is the index.cshtml displayed? The index.cshtml is displayed wherever you see the code called render body. So what happens is, when a controller calls a particular web page, a particular .cshtml file, that particular file is used along with the layout. That particular file is displayed in that particular layout page wherever this render body is there. So instead of render body, you will see the contents of the index.cshtml or abc.cshtml displayed right here. So this is the area where the render body is displaying the information from ABC or index or whichever page you're calling. And all these above and below are all layout. The layout is not only used for like menu items and images and so on. The layout is also used to control the look and feel of the entire application. If you want to control the look and feel of the application, you have to manipulate the cascading style sheets. Under your project, there is a folder called content, under which there are files called bootstrap.css and site.css. If you want to change the look and feel of your particular site, you can go to this cascading style sheet and then change the look and feel. For example, in the bootstrap.css, imagine I want to change the background color. So in the body background color, I can say something like, and I can select the blue. Save it, rebuild solution, and then debug start without debugging. Go to the particular site, If the style sheet is not immediately shown, please make sure that you refresh your browser. Sometimes it takes for it to show. So here you can see that we are controlling the look and feel. So any page we go to will have the blue background. So let us revert it back. As a developer, you are supposed to have a basic understanding of HTML and CSS. If you don't understand HTML and CSS, just go online and read about HTML and CSS or watch YouTube videos on CSS and HTML. You don't have to be an expert in those two languages, but you need to have a basic understanding. The CSS style sheets are usually created by expert graphic designers, and in a large application, they will give it to you and you just have to use those style sheets. Of course, if you get a new style sheet and you want to use a new style sheet, the place you have to change is under the app start folder, you will have something called as bundleconfig.cs. Over here, you can specify what style sheet to use. You can put your own style sheet name. So if you have your own custom style sheet, you can go change it right here. And also, imagine like you have a new layout and you want to display that layout only for a month or something like that. Can you change the entire layout? Yes, you can. Without changing the layout.cs HTML, we can always create another layout, like say layout 1, and then we can go to this viewstart.cs HTML, and over here we can specify what layout to use. Because in large organizations, you may have like 2 or 3 layouts, and depending on the season, you may want to change the entire look and feel, or you want to change the menu items and so on. So in this topic, we learned that whenever a web page is called, whenever a web page is written, you are just not seeing that web page, you are actually seeing the layout, and inside the layout, wherever you have this render body tag, that's exactly where you are seeing that particular web page. You can control the header and footer information in the layout. You can control the site's look and feel by going to site.css or bootstrap.css. If you want to put in new style sheets, you can go and specify which style sheet to load right here in the bundlesconfig.cs under application start. And you can also specify which layout to load in the viewstart.cs HTML. Now, whenever you start the application, by default, I said like it will go to the home controller and index action method. Is there any way you can control that? Now imagine this is the holiday season and we have like a special promotion page. Anyone who comes to our website should first go to that particular page. Is there any way we can control that? Yes, we can. Under app start folder, you will see something called as a routeconfig.cs. In the routeconfig.cs, you will have something called as routes.maproute. Here you can specify the default route, that is, by default, which controller and which action method do you want to load. Instead of home controller, I can specify load the XYZ controller index action method. Or for that matter, I can specify load the XYZ controller ABC action method. This will be the default route. Now when you start the application, by default it will go to the XYZ controller ABC action method. You can see that I have not included the /XYZ/ABC. So this is very useful whenever you have some kind of a promotion for like a month and by default you want to load another web page instead of your regular home controller index action method. Let's change this back to home and index. Now let us go back to our home controller and remove some of the stuff that we have changed here. For example, let the index method also return action result. Now we have changed the index method back to the action result and returns view, and about method also does the same thing, return view. Now when we run it, make sure you can build and rebuild to see if there are any errors. Debug start without debugging. And this is the home controller index action method. The home controller index action method returns a view. So that means it calls a web page called index.cshtml under a folder called home under the folder called views. So under a folder called views, we have a folder called home under which there is a index.cshtml. We don't need these texts. I'm deleting all of them. We're just going to keep, instead of ASP.NET, something like welcome to patrickvideos.com. You can run and check out the page. In our web application, you may wonder how do these links work. These are called action links. So if you look in our layout.cshtml file, you have a few action links. Now action links are overloaded methods. What are overloaded methods? They are methods of the same name differentiated by their passing arguments. Now let's not worry about that. Now there are different types of action links. Let us look at this simple action link. The action link has three parts. The first part is the display name. It tells you what exactly is displayed over here. The second part is the action method that you want to call, and the third part is the controller name. Display name, action method name, and the controller name. If you write any comment in the .cshtml file, this regular comment will not work. To make a comment in .cshtml, go to Views, Toolbars, make sure your text editor is selected, and you will have some kind of a comment window right here. Select the lines that you want to comment and click on comment out the selected lines. So this is how you comment a line in .cshtml. Of course, in C# you can use the 2 slashes. So here when we click on contact, it will call the home controller contact action method, the home controller's contact action method, and it will return the view. What will this view return? The view will go in search of the home folder under views, because this is the home controller, and to look for a page called contact.cshtml. And this contact.cshtml is returned along with the layout. So imagine I want to create another link for XYZ ABC page. So this XYZ-ABC will be displayed. I want to call the ABC action method in the XYZ controller. So the display name is XYZ-ABC. The action method that will be called as ABC, and XYZ is the controller name. Build, rebuild, debug, start without debugging. So here we can see that we have an XYZ-ABC. When we click on it, it goes to the XYZ-ABC page. Now you may be wondering, like, okay, when you clicked on this contact action method, what is this viewBag.message to? This viewBag is like a temporary variable to send some data, some kind of a dirty data from your controller to that particular view. Now we have learned that whenever you want to send data, you need to create objects and then have data in those objects and then pass that object over to the view. But sometimes we need to do some dirty work. I want to send some temporary data from this controller action method to that particular web page. In those cases, you can use something called as viewBag. Now, this is not a recommended way of programming. As a matter of fact, in serious application development, they will suggest never to use viewBag. But then the provision is given so that if you really want to use it, if there is no other way to send the data and it's a temporary fix, go ahead and use it. We can create any kind of data. Like for example, I can say viewBag.ijk. For example, I can say like viewBag.ijk equal to hello, this is the use of viewBag. And I can go to the contact page under views, home, contact. And here I can specify at viewBag.ijk. So whatever information I type there will be displayed right here in the contact. So if you go to your contact page, here you can see that hello, this is the use of viewBag. So a viewBag is used to send some temporary information from your controller and action method to that particular web page. Getting back to our MVC diagram, we have seen how the controller makes use of the model to create objects and then pass those objects to the view, displays them in the view, and then sends back that view to the user. Now we will learn how to fetch the data from the database. So we are now going to involve the database, and to involve the database, we need something called as the entity framework. Entity framework belongs to the .NET framework family. It is used in connecting to the database and working with the database. Now there are two ways to develop applications using the entity framework. One is called the code first, another is called the database first. In this tutorial, we will work with the code first, and then I will also show you how to develop using database first. To have a general idea what is the difference between code first and database first, in code first, we will first create the class files, and then we will create the tables based on those class files. We will create the database tables based on those class files. In database first is the conventional way of programming. You will first create the database and the tables, and then you will write code and SQL statements to fetch the data from the database. Now both have their advantages and disadvantages. Now as and when we create those applications, I will talk about what is the advantage of code first and what is the advantage of database first. Now the rest of this application I will complete using code first. Of course later on I will also show how to do a database first application. The first step in a code first application is create the class files that you want to make tables out of. If ever you close Visual Studio and you want to go back to your project, you can always click on File, Recent Projects and Solutions, and then select your project. Under Models, we already have a class called Student, and we would like to create a table out of this student class. Step 2, create a context class that extends DB context. Specify the name of the classes that you want to create a table out of. Under Models, let us create a class called, say, School Context. Right click on Models, Add Class, School Context, make sure the class is selected and click on Add. And this class we will extend from DB Context. Now DB Context will not be recognized, you just have to right click, Resolve, and then click on Using System.data.entity. And here you have to specify the class files that you want to create a table out of. Now here I have typed the statement public db set student students getter and setter method. Now what does this db context do? In the models folder you will have lots of class files, some of them with just business logic and some of them like class files which you want to create tables out of. For example, I want to create a table out of student and I will be creating a table out of course and all those things. But we will not be creating any table out of this account view model or identity model or school context. We don't want tables out of these class files. So when you have all these class files, how will the entity framework know which class files it should create tables out of? You need a place to put it. So that is what you call a school context which inherits from DB context. DB context is an inbuilt class in entity framework. Now if you put those particular class files right here, what it means is it will ignore all the other class files and it will create tables only for these class files. So in this case the entity framework will create a table out of the student class file. Putting your class file here also enables CRUD functionality, that is create, read, update and delete. We will see about that later. Now what is the students? Here afterwards you will refer to the students class, the student table as students in this particular application. We will see the details later on. Let's continue programming. Things will fall into place once everything is done. Now that we have created a class that we want to create table out of, and we have also specified in the school context class saying that I only want the student class as a table, ignore all the other classes. The third step is where do we create the table? Specify the database location and name that you would like to use. In the Solution Explorer, you will have something called as a web.config file at the very end. Remember there will be another web.config right here under this views folder, not that. You should go to the last web.config file. In that web.config file, you will see something called as a connection string, default connection, and some information right here. All you have to do is copy this particular tag. Web.config is an XML file. If you don't know XML, just go read up about it, the very basics of XML. It's not very complicated. Instead of using text files, they use XML file because it is a universal format understood by all languages and it is easier to parse an XML file than a text file. Or in other words, it's easier to read an XML file than a text file. So copy this default connection and paste it again, and in the add name, instead of default connection, give the name of your context class, that is school context. In your connection string of school context, go to where it says this my first project or some MDF file and replace this with school.mdf. Instead of such a big database name, you can simply say school.mdf or whatever database name you would like. You can leave everything else as it is. You don't have to change anything else. Now what this line means is we are going to create a database called school.mdf under the app data folder. This is going to be a local database and we are going to use system.data.sql client. Now you may say like, hey wait, I have like some other database and our database is located in the remote server. How do we do that? Now if you're using some other database and the database is located in some other remote server, then go to this website called connectionstrings.com. In connectionstrings.com, it will show you all the list of databases that connection strings are available for. These things are called connection strings. As you can see, they are under connection strings tag. Imagine you want to connect to the Oracle database. You can click on Oracle and it will tell you the properties of that connection string. But if this is the first time you're learning how to connect to the database, I recommend you follow me in this example connecting to the local database as I'm doing, and then you can go and play around with various connection strings depending on remote servers or other databases. So we have completed the third point, specify the database location and name that you would like to use. Step 4 is, let us initialize the database with some seed data. Under models, let us create a class called say school initializer, and this class is going to inherit from a class called drop create database if model changes. Make sure you resolve. You may want to pause the video and make sure that you get everything correct. Once you inherit from this class drop create database if model changes, this class has a virtual method called seed which you can override. You can go look at that particular method by double clicking on this class file and pressing on the F12 key. And here you can see that it has a seed method. You can navigate back to the class, and in the school initializer, let us implement the seed method. And in this seed method, let us create a list of students and add it to the school context. Now in the XYZ controller ABC method, you learned how to create a bunch of student objects and add them to a list of students. You can either do it this way, or I'm going to show you another easier syntax to create a list of students. So here we can see that we are going to create a new list which will only accept student objects. And instead of saying like student Alex equal to new student, instead of why do we have to give names for those particular student objects, we can just create a bunch of anonymous student objects. So here we have created a new student object with the first name James and last name Dean. Close the curly braces, comma. You can copy paste it and create another student object. And over here you put a semicolon to denote that we have finished creating the list of students. Now that we have created a list of students, we need to add it to the context file through which we will be adding it to the database. So for that, we will need to loop through this particular list. So to loop through a list, we will need the for each statement, and we are going to write it like this. So what we are doing here is, we are going to loop through the list of students for each var temp and students. So every time temp will have one object of the student, and we are going to add that particular temp to the student's context. So context.students.add temp. This context.students came here because the school context had this particular entry called students, and then we are calling context.save changes. Now this may be a bit overwhelming for now, but just keep up with me. Everything will fall into place very soon. Now that we have some seed data in this particular class, we need to run this class whenever the application starts so that there will be like some kind of a seed data. Make sure you save your particular class. Whenever you make any changes, make sure you save it. You can also click on build rebuild solution to see if there are any errors in your particular program. To call the school initializer, go to the global.asax file. You will find them in the Solution Explorer, a file called global.asax. In the application start method, you can call the initializer like this. Database dot, if you want you can resolve the database and you can remove the dot and press it again. You can call the set initializer and here create a new object of school initializer. Make sure you resolve. Once you have resolved everything, make sure you click on build rebuild solution and see if there are no errors. So the fifth step is call the initializer in the global.asax file application start method. Now let us go back to the XYZ controller ABC action method. In the ABC action method, we have created all these objects like student and course and all those things. What we are going to do is we are going to comment out everything, select everything, comment out the selected lines. Instead, we are going to use LINQ, that is language integrated query that we learned in C# to fetch the data from the entity class. To fetch the data from the database, we first need access to that particular database. If you remember in web.config, we gave this connection string called school context, which also is the same name that we gave to our context class. So the school context represents the database. So in the XYZ controller, above all the methods, create an instance of that particular school context. So we have specified here private school context database equal to new school context. Now this object DB is the instance of school context, which in turn represents this class, which enables the CRUD functionality. Now let us write a link statement to fetch the data from that particular students table. We are yet to create the students table, but it's going to be automatically created. So we're going to say var students equal to db dot students. This is from the school context class students dot toList. What the statement means is fetch everything from the students class, which in turn is connected to the table, and then convert it to a list and put it in this var called students. Now this students implicitly typed variable will contain all the student information available in that particular table. Make sure that you comment out even this return view here, and here we are going to say like return view students. So this ABC method is going to return a list of students fetched from the database. Now let us go to the ABC page, that is under the XYZ folder abc.cshtml page. Make sure that we specify that this ABC page receives a list of students. The way we do that, if you remember, is IEnumerable myfirstproject.model.students. That means this page is going to receive a list of students. Of course, we are not sending any course object or anything like that, so let us comment this out. To comment out in CSHTML, just select it and press the comment button. And here we need that for each statement var item in model. This model represents the list of students. And then here like item.firstname and last name will be printed. So now that we have everything, let us run this application and see the data from the database displayed on this ABC page. Make sure you don't have any errors. Debug, start without debugging. Wow, now we have got the students right here. Now if you get some error or any kind of a compilation error, revisit the video again. I have not done anything away from this particular video. So let us revisit the various steps and see what exactly happened. We wanted to use the entity framework to connect to the database. For that, we had two choices. We had a code first or a database first. We first decided to learn code first. In code first, we need to create class files and create tables based out of the class files. For code first, these are the various steps that we need to follow. Step 1, first create the class files that you want to create tables out of. Under models, we have a class called student with the student ID, last name and first name, which we are interested in creating a table out of. Second, create a context class that extends DB context, and in that file specify the tables that you want to create. So we created a school context that inherits from DB context, and we specified of all these class files in the models, we only want to create table for the student class, and it's going to be referred to as students. Third step is where exactly do you want to create this table, the database location and the name and all those things. We went to the last web.config file, we copy pasted an existing connection string, renamed it as school context. This name should match this school context, and we went and changed the name of the database to something like school.mdf. And we also saw like if you want to connect to another database, you can go to connectionstrings.com, which will show you all types of connection strings that you can make. Fourth step is initializing with some seed data. We created a class under models called school initializer, which inherited from a class called drop create database if model changes, which had a method called seed, which received an object of school context. Here we created a list of students. We looped through those list of students and we added to the context.students, and then we called the context.savechanges. In the global.asx file application start method, we called the school initializer. So in the global.asx, in this line we are calling the school initializer. Next we went to the controller and we created an instance of that particular context, and we use link to fetch the data from the database. In the XYZ controller ABC action method, we have commented out all the lines, and we said var students equal to db.students.toList. DB stands for an instance of school context, which now represents the database. This line will fetch all the records of the students and convert it to a list, and then we are sending the list of students to the view. And in that abc.cshtml, we are receiving a list of students. We are looping through the list of students for each var item in model. Model represents the list of students. This is capital M, and we are displaying the list of students. When we build, rebuild, and debug start without debugging, we started the application and went to the XYZ controller ABC action method, and then we were able to see the list of students. Now you may be wondering, like, where exactly is the database? The database is stored in the app data folder. You can take a look at it. You can go to the app data folder, click on this small button which says show all files. If you are unable to see this, you will have to drop down over here. You will see something called a show all files, and in here you will see that school.mdf. You can right click on it, include in project, and double click on the school.mdf. Once you double click on school.mdf, the server explorer window will show up. Open tables, and here you will see that students table, and inside which you have the student ID, last name, and first name. You can right click and then show table data, and it will show up the table data right here. You can also right click and open table definition, and here you can see that what kind of a data type has been automatically given for that particular column. Student ID is integer, and all these are nvarchar. And the create table command is also given, how it was created. So you can see we just created the class files, and the entity framework took care of creating the database and the table for us. Now it comes with lots of advantages and disadvantages, which we are going to see as and when we create this particular application. Now one of the questions you may have is, how did the student ID generate these numbers called 1 and 2? We never gave this kind of student ID. Let us go back to the Solution Explorer. In this, let us go back to our models folder, student class. While creating a model class, if you give a data or property named student ID, that is a class name and ID, it is automatically assumed that this will be the primary key. And if it is an integer, it will be auto-generated. For example, if this class had been XYZ, and if you had a public int XYZ ID, that means that column called XYZ ID will be the primary key, and it will auto-generate. Not only that, you can also have the column as just ID. What happens if I don't want it to auto-generate and I want to give my own IDs? Well, we will learn about that very soon. For now, remember, any column which is integer, class name, and ID is considered a primary key, and it will auto generate that particular ID. Also, you can see the tabs here which have like Solution Explorer and Server Explorer. Make sure that whenever you open the database to view the tables, that you will always close it. To close the database, you just right click on the school context, click on close connection. Once it's closed, you will see that X mark right here. So whenever your entity framework fails to create the data for some reason, you can also make a check whether your local database is closed or not. Now let us continue our project by creating a few more class files. Imagine in our particular university, we have a bunch of students and we also have a bunch of courses. And then we want to denote that one student can be enrolled in multiple courses. At the same time, one course can have multiple students. So that means like Alex can be enrolled in Java and C#, whereas Java can have both Alex and John. So basically it is a many-to-many relationship. One student can be enrolled in multiple courses. One course will have multiple students. If you want to denote a many-to-many relationship between student and course, how would you define that? How can you specify that Alex is enrolled in both Java and C#? How do you specify that in this table? At the same time, if I want to denote that this Java has like Alex, Sarah, and John enrolled, how do I specify that in this table right here? To do that, we will need a third table like say enrollment. So for many-to-many relationship, we will usually have a third table. So this third table called enrollment has an enrollment ID, its own primary key, and then it has this student ID and course ID. So here you can see the data. Student ID 1, that is Alex, is enrolled in 200 and student ID 1 is enrolled in 300. That means Alex is enrolled in C# and ASP. Student ID 2, Sarah, is enrolled in course ID 100, that is Java. You can also have other data in the enrollment table. This is what you call a payload, that is extra data in the join table. This enrollment is considered a join table. So what is this payload used for? Student ID 1 Alex in course ID 200 C# received a grade of 3.9. Alex in course ASP received a grade of 4.0. So this is some extra information that you can have in enrollment. So let us go and create these three classes. In the student class, let us add one more field called enrollment date. In the course class, we have like a course ID. Once again, it is class name and then capital I and D, course name and total credits. And let us create another class called enrollment. And in the third class called enrollment, we have enrollment ID, which will be the primary key. We also have the student ID and course ID, just like our table. And then we have a grade. You will notice that the grade has this decimal question mark. What does this decimal question mark stand for? When we look at the enrollment table, not every student will have a grade. Maybe the person is yet to take the exam or so on. If you have a decimal column without the question mark, what would happen is, if you don't have a value, it will denote it as 0.0. That is the default value for decimal columns. But then it will give a wrong idea. It will show as if like John received a grade of 0 in Java, which is not correct. He is yet to take the exam. So to avoid confusion like this, if you put a question mark right next to the decimal, it means that this grade column will accept a null value. You can assign null to that particular grade. It will simply be blank. Now that we have mentioned all the columns of these class files, we should now mention the relationship between these class files. Basically, we should mention the relationship between the tables. Looking at these three tables, the relationship is going to be like every student is going to have a bunch of enrollments. So it's going to be a one-to-many relationship. One student is going to have multiple enrollments. Same way, one course is going to have multiple enrollments. So go to the student class and specify this property, I collection of enrollments. Now this would specify that every student will have a collection of enrollments. That means the relationship between the student and enrollment table is going to be one-to-many. The same thing goes for the course class. Every course is going to have multiple enrollments. Now instead of using I collection, you can also use list of enrollments. That is fine too. Now that we have mentioned that a course has multiple enrollments and a student has multiple enrollments, we also have to mention that every enrollment has one student and one course. So every enrollment has access to one student object and one course object. These are also called navigation properties. So every enrollment has access to one student object and one course object. So here you can see that when you look at it from the enrollment perspective, every enrollment will have access to one student and one course object. Now that we have created the three classes, what is the next step? The second step is create a context class that extends DB context, specify the names of the classes. We already have the context class, we just have to specify the names of the classes. So we have like DB set course courses and DB set enrollment enrollments. Now if you remember, in our Server Explorer, under our tables, the table name was students. It took the name what was given here. But usually table names are not pluralized. They are usually like employee, department. We don't want them to be pluralized right here. It is fine to pluralize it right here while accessing those particular table. We can say like db.students.toList, but we want the table to be like singular. So how do we stop Entity Framework from using this particular name? You add this method protected override void on model creating model builder.conventions.remove pluralizing table name convention. Make sure you resolve this. Once you add this, the next time the database is created, your tables will no longer be pluralized. It will be like student, course, and enrollment. But of course, this is optional. The third step is specify the database, which we have already done that. And the fourth step is initialize with some seed data. So let's go and initialize with some seed data. In school initializer, let's add some enrollment date. Enrollment date equal to date time dot parse and give some date. So here we have a list of courses. We are looping through the list of courses and then we are saving it to the context. Make sure when you're copy pasting that you have the enrollments right here, as well as you change this context dot to whatever the class name. You're likely to miss out on few things when you copy paste. So now that we have the seed data ready, call the initializer, it's already done. In the controller, like we are creating one table, so that's fine. And then displaying the data, that's fine. So let's run this and see if all the three data has been saved in the database. Once again, make sure that the school context database in the Server Explorer is closed. You can right click and close the connection. Build and rebuild the solution and debug start without debugging. You can go to this XYZ ABC to see if it is working. Once you run this, you will have to click on this particular link. Unless and until you click on this particular link and trigger that particular database connection, the database and tables will not be created. You can go here and double click and open this, go to tables, and here you can see all the three tables. Once again, if you're not able to see them right here, try refreshing and also make sure that you click on that link which is going to access the tables. Unless and until you access the data, those tables are not going to be triggered. This will only be needed for the very first time when the application starts, not all the time. You can show the table data for course and show table data for enrollment and everything looks fine. Now that we have seen a ton of information, let us do a quick review of all the things that we have learned. What program is called by the URL or the request? When you have a URL or a request, the controller is the first program to be called. If you do not specify the controller and action method, the default home controller and index action method are called. So the home controller's index action method is called by default. Where do you specify the default controller and action method to call? Under the app start folder, you will have a routeconfig.cs. Over here, you can specify what is the default controller and action method to call. So if you specify like XYZ and ABC over here, whenever someone visits your site, the very first controller and action method that will be called will be the XYZ controller ABC action method. Given some URL yahoo.com/finance/stock, name the controller and action method. So in any URL, you will see that the very first one will be the controller name and the next slash you will have the action method name. Of course, this is true for applications developed using ASP.NET MVC. Yahoo need not have developed it using ASP.NET MVC. How do you create views? How to name the views? Well, you can create views two ways. The easiest way would be like to go to the action method, right click on the action method and then click on add view. And then if you click on add, it will create a page called index in a folder called home under views. So the page name and the action method name should match. So you will see like three pages under the home folder. One will be called index, the other about and contact. Index, about and contact. You can also create views by right clicking on the folder and click on add view. That's fine, but then you will have to make sure that you give an appropriate name. What can an action method return? Well, you will usually see action methods return an action result. If you see something like action result, you need to put a return view right here. We also learned that it can return a string, but that's going to be very rare in a web application. Or you may also see something like a view result. Now, action result and view result are almost the same. One is a subclass of the other. How do you pass data to the view? So in these kind of methods, we are not passing anything to the view. But if you take a controller and action method like this, if you want to pass one object or a bunch of objects, you can put those objects right here inside the view. You cannot pass multiple objects like this. You cannot do that. View will either take only one object or a list of an object. How do you specify that a view receives an object or multiple objects? If you take a look at this particular page called abc.cshtml, you can look at this particular line and you will be able to say that this particular page abc.cshtml receives a list of student object. Here you can see that you have the IEnumerable, so that means this receives a list of student objects. If you don't specify that IEnumerable, that means this receives one student object. What is the difference between at the lowercase model and at uppercase model? You use the lowercase model right here on the very first line to specify what type of object you are receiving to this particular web page. Whenever you want to refer to this object, then you will use the uppercase M. Also remember, once you use the at symbol here, you need not have it again over here. What concept will you use if you want to display information from multiple classes in a view? We can even call it like, how do you display like information from multiple tables in a view, given the restriction that it can only display like one class or a list of a particular class? We can always use the concept of view models. We can create class files which in turn contain objects of different classes. In this case, you can see that we have one object of course and a list of students. You can have a list of courses and list of students, or like one course and one student object too. Then what we can do is we can create an object of this particular view model, and we can make sure that we can pass this particular object to the view, and in the view we can receive that particular object. What are the various steps involved in creating a database and tables? The question is basically like, how do you involve the model and create database and all those things? In the code first or class first design, the very first step is create the class files that you want to make tables out of. So here you can see that we created a class called student, which has a student ID, last name, first name and enrollment date. Make sure that the student ID is class name and then you have this ID, so that this will be the primary key and it will also auto generate that particular primary key. We are also defining the relationship between various classes. For example, this student class has a one-to-many relationship with the enrollment class, whereas the enrollment class, each and every enrollment record will have only one student and one course object. Same way for courses, course ID is the primary key and then every course will have multiple enrollments. Once you have created the class files that you want to make tables out of, you have to create a context class that extends db context and specify the names of the classes that you want to create a table out of. We have something called as a school context class which inherits db context, and over here you specify all the class files that you want to create tables out of. There will be lots of class files that only deal with the business logic. You need not create tables out of. So those kind of class files, you need not mention it here. This will enable the CRUD functionality so that you will be able to insert, update, delete from these particular tables. You can also specify this model building.conventions.remove pluralizing table name conventions. That is, when you create the tables, if you don't want them to be pluralized like this, you can put this particular line. If you do not put this particular line, the tables will be called students, courses and enrollments. Since you have this, the tables will be called student, course and enrollment as given here. Once we have created the context class, we need to specify where the location of the database is and the name of the database and so on. You can go to the last web.config file, and here you have to make sure that the name of the context file matches this connection string, and we change the name of this database to school.mdf. If you're working in a corporate environment, your DBA or your team members will tell you where exactly the database is located. Once you have specified where the database is located and the class files, you need to initialize with some seed data. So we created a class called school initializer, which inherits from drop create database if model changes. So this school initializer has a seed method which receives the context object, and over here we are creating a list of students and we are looping through the list of students and we are adding the list of students to the particular context. This context, remember, represents our database. We are doing the same thing for courses as well as enrollments. Remember, this order is very important. Because this enrollment depends on course ID and student ID, you cannot insert enrollments in the very beginning and the student and course at the very end. It will throw errors because of referential integrity constraints. The next step will be to call this initializer in the global.asax file's application start method. You will notice this global.asax file, and in here you will have the application start method, and in this place you can call the initializer. In the controller, create an instance of the context and use link to connect to the database and fetch the data. So here in a controller we need access to the database. As mentioned before, like the school context will represent our database. So here we are creating an object of this school context, and then we are specifying like db.students, which is our table, dot to list. That means fetch everything from the students table, convert it to a list and put it in an implicitly typed variable called students, and then return the particular view that is called the abc.cshtml and pass the list of students, and the abc.cshtml receives the list of students over here, loops through the list of students and prints out the first name and last name. Creation of tables failed. Apart from checking if the database is closed, what else must you do? Well, if you have some issues while creating tables and all those things, a few things that you can do is make sure your database is closed. If your database is open like this, right click and click on close connection. You can also right click on that school.mdf and exclude from project. You can always show all files right here. So that means like this has been excluded from the project school.mdf. Make sure that you build, rebuild and there are no errors. And when you run this particular application, make sure that you go to that particular website and see if it is showing the list of students right here. This has to be triggered for the tables to be created behind the scene. What other pages are returned along with the view? We learned that whenever you show a particular view, it's not just that particular CSS/HTML page we are returning to the user, we are returning that particular page inside of a layout. We have a layout, and then inside of that particular layout where the render body tag is, we will display that particular page. So under the views shared folder, you will have this layout.cshtml page, which will have the header and footer information. And while displaying this particular layout, wherever this render body is, we will replace that render body with the .cshtml page we returned. Where do you specify the style sheet? You can specify which style sheet to use in the app start folder bundleconfig.cs file. Here you can specify what style sheets to use. You can also go to this bootstrap.css under the content folder and modify the existing style sheets. How do you specify the relationship between classes or tables? So in this case, the student class has multiple enrollments, that means a one-to-many relationship. You specify it right here. You can either use list or you can use iCollection. And here you are specifying an one-to-one relationship. Every enrollment has one student and one course. What is the use of the viewBag property? You can use this viewBag property to send some temporary information from the action method to that particular view. So in this case, you have this viewBag.ijk, which has some string, and in the contact.cshtml you can display that viewBag.ijk. This method of programming is never recommended, but it is given to you just in case. The final question, how do you specify a particular column as the primary key and auto-generate? When you have a particular class, how do you specify that this has to be the primary key? Well, if you follow the naming convention, that is class name ID, for the student class, it should be called student ID. That means by default, the entity framework will consider this as the primary key and it will auto-generate that primary key. That is why whenever we created the student objects, we never gave the primary key. It will always auto-generate the primary key. Of course, we will learn how to create our own primary keys later on. We will also learn about annotations where we specify compound primary keys or primary key names which do not follow this particular convention.